Welcome back to our deep dive series on the MPEP.
Yeah, the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure. We're trying to make it a bit more digestible.
Exactly. Less wading through dense text, more focused conversation. Today we're hitting MPEP section 2107.
Right, Section 2107, it's sitting right there in Chapter 2100, which is all about patentability.
So this section is pretty fundamental then.
Oh, absolutely. It sets out the USPTO's guidelines on, well, utility, making sure inventions actually meet the useful requirement from the law, specifically 35 U.S.C. Section 101.
And I see it also mentions section 112A.
It does, yeah, because, usefulness is often tied to whether you've actually explained how to use the invention, which is what Section 112A covers. The two often go hand in hand in rejections.
Okay, so section 2107 is basically the rule book for examiners on whether an invention is useful enough for a patent.
That's a good way to put it. It tells them when to accept a claim, when to question it, and when to actually reject it for lacking utility.
Got it. So what are the big ideas we need to pull out of this section, the main takeaways?
Well, the first and probably most cited concept is specific and substantial utility.
Specific and substantial. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means the claimed use can't just be vague or generally applicable to anything. It has to be specific to the invention itself.
And substantial.
Substantial means it has to have a real-world, practical purpose, not just, say, an object of research interest, but something with tangible benefit.
Okay, specific, substantial. So not just this compound does stuff.
Exactly. That vague biological activity example they give, that's not enough. Or saying something has diagnostic use without saying what it diagnoses or how.
Right, you need more detail.
Yeah, the MPEP points to a case, Nelson v. Bowler is a good example. There, showing a compound-affected uterine smooth muscle was considered specific enough.
Because that's a defined biological effect with, potential real-world applications.
Precisely. It's concrete, unlike just saying it has potential.
So if I claim a new chemical has useful properties, that's probably getting rejected.
Almost certainly yes. You need to say what properties and why they're useful in a specific, substantial way.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the next key concept?
Credibility of utility.
Credibility. So it has to be believable.
Right. Believable to a posita, a person of ordinary skill in the art. The claimed use can't fly in the face of, established scientific principles.
Ah, so this is where the perpetual motion machines come in.
Exactly. Or, maybe a drug claiming to cure every known disease with one dose. If it sounds scientifically incredible, it fails the utility test right there. The examiner doesn't need absolute proof it's impossible, just that it lacks credibility based on current science.
So no patents on my anti-gravity boots just yet.
Probably not based on current physics, no.
Okay, credible utility. Got it. What about well-established utility?
That's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. It's when the utility is so obvious from the invention itself that someone skilled in that field would immediately understand its usefulness just by reading the description.
Like your mousetrap example from earlier.
Perfect example. You don't need pages explaining why catching mice is useful. It's well established.
So specific and substantial, credible, and sometimes well-established. What happens if an examiner isn't convinced? How does a rejection work?
Okay, so if an examiner thinks there's a lack of utility under Section 101, they have to issue a rejection. But crucially, they need to explain why.
They need a reason.
A solid reason, yeah. They have to establish what's called a prima facie case. They need to articulate why the claimed utility isn't specific, substantial, or credible, often citing evidence if possible.
So the burden is on the examiner first.
Initially, yes, to make that prima facie case. But once they do, the burden shifts.
Shifts to the applicant.
Right. The applicant then has to come back with arguments or evidence to rebut the examiner's reasoning and show that the utility is actually there.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier this often links to Section 112.
Very often. The guidelines explicitly state that a Section 101 utility rejection usually goes along with a Section 112A rejection for lack of enablement.
Because if the use isn't credible or well-defined?
Then how could you have possibly taught someone how to achieve that use? The logic is, if the utility itself is flawed, the instructions on how to use it probably are too.
Makes sense. It's hard to write a user manual for something that doesn't work or has no clear purpose.
Exactly. But there's an important point here too. Examiners are told they must treat the applicant's factual statements about utility as true unless Unless there's clear scientific evidence contradicting it, they can't just dismiss the applicant's assertion out of hand based on a hunch. There needs to be a basis in evidence or established scientific principle for the doubt.
That seems fair. A balance between scrutiny and giving the inventor the benefit of the doubt initially.
It aims to be, yes.
Does Section 2107 get into specifics for certain types of inventions?
It does. It gives particular guidance for evaluating therapeutic or pharmacological claims, things related to treating diseases, how much proof is needed, what kind of testing might support credibility.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah, also how to look at the utility of research tools. Things that might not cure a disease themselves, but are useful for scientists doing the research. That can be a valid utility.
So a new microscope technique or a specific assay?
Could be, yes. If it provides a specific, substantial, and credible benefit for research. And finally, it clarifies the standard for calling something totally inoperative, which is a pretty high bar. Means it just flat out doesn't work as claimed at all.
Wow, okay, so Section 2107 really covers the whole spectrum of usefulness, from the obvious to the questionable to the downright unbelievable.
It really does. It's about making sure patents are granted for things that offer some concrete advancement, some real utility, not just, ideas without practical application or things that defy science.
It's ensuring the patent bargain exclusivity for disclosure is based on something genuinely useful.
That's the core idea. Specific, substantial, credible utility.
This has been super helpful in breaking down Section 2107. It seems like a cornerstone for patent examination.
Definitely. And, what's interesting is how these concepts have to adapt. Think about emerging tech AI, new biotech defining specific and substantial utility. There isn't always straightforward. The case law and guidance have to evolve.
That's a great point. The principles stay, but the application changes with the science.
Exactly.
So for you listening, getting a handle on Section 2107 is crucial, whether you're writing patents, studying for the exam, or just trying to understand patent value. This utility piece is non-negotiable.
Which leads to kind of a final thought, maybe. How differently might you approach invention development or documentation if you were thinking about demonstrating specific, substantial, and credible utility right from day one?
That's interesting. Building the case for utility during the R&D, not just after.
It could potentially shape the experiments you run, the data you collect, making the patenting process smoother later on.
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
Just a quick formal bit here. This deep dive is part of our ongoing series exploring the MPEP, section by section.
Trying to provide these focused overviews for practitioners, students, anyone needing to navigate U.S. patent law.
Today was MPEP Section 2107 from Chapter 2100 on patentability. We covered the USPTO's guidelines for the utility requirement under 35 U.S.C. Section 101 and its connection to Section 112A.
Yeah, we hit on specific and substantial utility, credibility, well-established utility, and saw some examples like Nelson v. Bowler versus vague claims.
We also touched on how rejections work, the burden shifting, the link between Section 101 and Section 112, and the guidance for things like therapies and research tools.
And the important disclaimer. Remember, this summary was put together with assistance from AI tools like ChatGPT and NotebookLM. While we aim for accuracy, there might be errors.
Absolutely. This is for educational and informational purposes only. It's definitely not legal advice.
Please consult the official MPEP itself or talk to a qualified instructor or registered patent practitioner for authoritative guidance.
And a quick thank you to Mike Shepard, the creative director who helps organize this whole series.
Yes, thanks, Mike.
So the bottom line on Section 2107, utility matters. Is it specific, substantial, credible? Nail those and you're on the right track. Thanks for joining our deep dive today.